All right, so today we're going to be talking about the second aorist in Greek, the second aorist indicative. Before we get there, I want to say that in English, there are two ways to have a past tense verb. There's the regular verb, and this is going to be the verbs that end in an ed, so jumped, kicked, and there's thousands of them. So I'm not going to write them all out, but the emphasis here is on the ed. I jumped, I kicked, I totally having a blank here. I moved. So the key characteristics to these verbs are the ed at the end. These are called regular verbs. And then irregular verbs, kind of what we've seen with Greek, is that the stem changes. So irregular. So stem changes. I'll just write that down for all of you. And then ed. So in the irregular verb, we have the word swim. And then in the past tense, it becomes swam. I swam across the lake. You would never say I swimmed across the lake, because swimmed is not a word. Or I run to the store, but in the past tense, I ran to the store. In these cases here, we're just swapping out vowels, but the stem is still changing. The present tense is drive. I drive to work every day. In the past tense, I drove home from work today. So we can see that the irregular stem, the irregular verbs, the stem is slightly different than in the present tense. Whereas here we have an ed. We might be able to call that the tense formative, if there is such a category for the regular verb in English. We have ed versus a stem change. Kind of what we saw last week, or even in the in the future tense, how the stem changed just a little bit in the future tense. This is kind of the same thing here. So the good news with the second aorist is that there's going to be a different form, but it's going to fall into one or two categories. So it's either going to fall into the first category, which is called the first aorist, and this is where the stem changes slightly, or there is no change to the root. So slight, maybe even, I'm just going to write no change to root. So examples of these would be luo. Luo is a root that doesn't change. We could even go pistuo. And then in the aorist, you're going to see an augment, and you probably are going to see a saw down here, but these are verbs that fall into the first aorist. So we call this the regular verbs. The irregular verbs are going to be called the second aorist. And so these are where the roots are going to be very different. Keys to this one would be Lego, erkomai, lambano, and so on. So these verbs in the past tense, the stem is going to be looking very different. So the aorist active stem for Lego is ape. And then we have the connecting vowel omicron, and then the personal ending new. So that is the aorist active stem. Ergomai, we're going to have epsilon, lambda, elf plus the augment here. These contract to become in eta, as we've learned earlier, the rules of contracting verbs. And then we're going to have the connecting vowel in the personal ending nu. Lambano, we're going to have the stem be lab with the aorist there, and la bone, as we can see, the personal or the connecting vowel and the personal ending. So the key to understanding both of these, and like I've been saying for several weeks now, there's a difference between form and function. So while the first and the aorist both have the same function, meaning that luo in the past tense is going to be elusa. I'll just write that out for you here. Elusa, and it means I loosed. Again, apon is the second aorist, looks very different than elusa, means I spoke. So the function is the same between the first aorist and the second aorist. The form is very different because we have no change to root and a completely different stem in the aorist, or at least in the second aorist. So kind of what we saw with the third declension, there aren't any words that can be both first aorist and second aorist. Luo will always be a first aorist. Lego will always be a second aorist. And so every single word that is a second aorist is going to always be a second aorist. Every word that is always a first aorist will always be a first aorist. So there's no overlap. The upshot to this is that you know that the second aorist will always take the imperfect ending, as we learned last week. And so you look at apon, it's not imperfect, but it's aorist, is the true tense. So on the upshot, you know that the second aorist will always take the imperfect endings and may look like an imperfect. The downside is that there are no patterns between lambano, erkomai, lego. There really are no set roots in the second aorist. So this is where vocabulary is important. If you're not memorizing your vocabulary and the principal parts, you may not be able to understand what the word is when you come across it. So memorize your principal parts, memorize how these words function. No.
So in the second aorist, we would find the root?
No, you will find a different root in the second aorist. Because erk here is the true root, or rather it's the present tense root. Here we have elf as the root. So the root will be completely different in the second aorist. That's why it's important to know your vocabulary, because if you don't know your vocabulary, you won't be able to understand the form.
So it's good to learn the perfect parts.
Principal parts. Well, yes, it is very important to memorize the principal parts. So, English, we have the, like I said, we have the I jumped, I kicked, I moved. These are all called undefined. Whereas last week we talked about the imperfect having the continuous sense, the imperfect sense we don't know when it's going to end. The undefined is just a simple I kicked. I kicked the ball. I jumped the fence. It's just a simple verb. It's an undefined verb. And that's why the aorist is not necessarily the tense in the indicative for narrative. It's not telling stories, because when we tell stories, we want to kind of have a little bit of flavor to it, a little bit of that continuous action. I went to the store. And so kind of the aorist is not really a versatile tense for telling stories. But we find it has an undefined aspect to it. So whether it's the first aorist or the second aorist, they're both going to have the same function. They're both going to have an undefined sense. So you're just going to have a simple past tense verb, I kicked the ball, or I hit the ball, or whatever. So I hit would be an irregular verb because it doesn't have that ed tense formative. So I could go / hit the ball. So while there's a different function here, or sorry, a different form here, the function is the same. It's a simple past tense. I hit the ball, I kicked the ball. I ate last night, I am eating today. So there you can see even eat is an irregular verb. So Greek has it exactly the same way. The aorist tense, whether it's first or second aorist, is just going to be a simple verb here. You just apply that simple meaning of the verb. So if you see luo, or in this case it'd be past tense, we're going to have the augment, the sigma, and the alpha. We'll learn about that later. This one would be I loosed the ball. That's simple ed. So if we had ericomai, and I'll show you kind of here what's happening here with ericomai. So we have the present tense root, which is eric. We're not going to worry about that. So we'll just finish that up for you. So ericomai is what we've learned, what we've seen. In the past tense, the root or the stem is going to be an epsilon, a lambda, and a theta. That is our aorist active stem. But we have the augment, because it's past tense. The augment and the indicative always tells you it's a past tense verb. So we're going to have the augment here plus the epsilon, like I just said. Those contract, and we get an eta. Then we have the connecting vowel omicron, and then we have the personal ending nu. So aelthone would be probably, if we were to see this in Greek, we would probably see something like I came to the house. Again, so we see aelthone, I came, or I spoke today. So even the second aorist just has that simple, if we saw Lego in the past tense, I spoke would be here, or they spoke, because the indicative or the imperfect endings can either be the first person singular or the third person plural. I spoke today, I spoke to the house, I came to the house. You see that it just has a very undefined action here. So kind of the key to the aorist is that it simply tells you that something happened. Like I said, it's that undefined nature there. And one thing that what we want to see here, so I'm going to give you the augment, which tells us it's past tense, plus the aorist active stem, which is actually, it's not lam, it's lab. And then we're going to have plus the connecting vowel, which is omicron, plus the personal ending. So if we were to parse this, how would we parse this? We're going to go aorist, because this is the tense. We know this in part because we know our vocabulary. Aorist, active or middle passive?
Middle. Active.
Active. What is the mood?
Indicative.
Indicative.
Now, would you say first or second aorist?
This one is, it doesn't, yeah, great point, Tony. So when you're parsing, yes, I said that there's a difference between the first aorist and the second aorist. We've already done it over here. It's aorist. Mm-hmm. So again, there's no difference between, in function, there's no difference between the first aorist and the second aorist. So they both have the same function. So you're going to parse them aorist. Aorist, active, indicative. First person, because we see the men here, plural, from lambano, but lambano is a second aorist. It has that category. Again, there's a difference between form and function.
So you wouldn't write first aorist active or second?
Nope. And then, so elabomen, the inflected meaning would be we took or we received. is kind of what we would see here. So again, we'll unpack this just a little bit so we can kind of see how it looks. But the aorist is just a simple, undefined action. I spoke, I ate, I talked. You're not really doing a whole lot with the verb there. So let me just kind of write out the paradigm for you. We have elle bonne, which is the first person singular. Elle baisse. Elle ben. Elle bomen. Elle beta. And elle bonne. So again, the keys to understanding the aorist is that it does in fact have the augment, and then we see the aorist stem there, which is lab, and then we have the connecting vowel, which has been the same all throughout. It's either omicron or epsilon. So we see omicron, epsilon, epsilon, omicron, epsilon, omicron. So we see the connecting vowel there, and then the personal endings, just what we saw in the imperfect. We have the nu, the sigma, the nu, the men, the te, and then the nu. And so here we have elle bonne and elle bonne. How do we know if it's the difference between I took and they took? Context. Context will tell us whether this is third plural or first singular. So as you're translating, you come across elle bonne. Oh, well, I don't know which one this is. Your context will tell you if it's I took or they took. There's a difference between the two, so do know that it is important to know the difference. So, and as we saw last week, the aorist will take either the secondary active personal endings. Right now this is the secondary active, or it will take the secondary middle passive endings. So the principal parts for lambano, this is important, and I want to kind of run them out here real quick. So the principal parts are going to be the key to understanding the verb. When you're looking at vocab, Mounce will be nice and give you the principal parts in parentheses. Actually, not in parentheses. He'll give you the principal parts. So we have the first principal part of lambano, which is lambano. So the first principal part will always be the present active indicative, or present middle passive. So present middle passive, present active fall into that first principal part because it has the present active stem. Then if you're looking at your vocab, you'll notice one word typically in parentheses. Elimbanon is what we see here. So this is the imperfect. The imperfect doesn't have its own principal part, and the reason for that is because the imperfect takes the stem of the present active. And so the imperfect, like we learned last week, takes the present active indicative stem. And so lambano and elimbanon are both the present active indicative stem. Then we have lampsomai, which is the deponent, but this is the future, so we see that the root has changed in the future tense. This is the second principal part. Lampsomai looks very different than lambano. So this is why it's important to memorize your vocabulary, because it could be a very different stem, very different root in different tenses. We see that lampsomai doesn't look anything like lambano. Mm-hmm. Now we have the aorist, which is going to have the augment. Elle bonne is the third principal part. And then we have Elefa, oops, not elefe, elefa, as the fourth principal part, which is the perfect active indicative. And then the fifth principal part is going to be the perfect passive or perfect middle passive. And this one is a lame, a double lambda here, a lamai. And we just see a very different stem or very different root here than what we've seen before. And then the last principal part is going to be the aorist passive or future passive. A lame, a lengthening. So again, just very important to know your principal parts. There are only 6 of them, and if you understand the principal parts in the different tenses, you will be you'll be set up to succeed when you get into different tenses. So pay attention to your principal parts. One last thing I want to talk about, and this is going to be the second aorist middle. It won't be the second aorist passive because the second aorist passive is going to be reserved for the 6th principal part. But we will only talk about the aorist middle, or the second aorist middle, just like we looked at the imperfect middle passive and the future middle earlier. So the paradigm here is not going to be lambano, because lambano already has an active paradigm. So we're going to go with genomai, which is a deponent. What again is a deponent? A deponent is a word that is middle passive in form, but active in function. So the word here we're going to be using is going to be the word genomai in the present, which means I become. So in the past tense, in the aorist tense, it's going to be a simple I became. So again, we're going to have the aorist, or sorry, not the aorist, we're going to have the augment for the past tense, plus the aorist stem. In this case, the iota morphed into an epsilon. It just is. And then we have the connecting vowel. And then we have the personal ending, which in this case is main, which means it's the secondary middle passive first person singular personal ending. And it's egenomain, which means I became. Again, middle and passive in form, or sorry, middle in form, active in function. So the whole paradigm here, we can basically fill it out based on what we learned last week. It's going to be, again, Omicron is our connecting vowel. Actually, it is not Omicron as our connecting vowel. It's actually epsilon, but in this case, there's some contraction going on, and it becomes egenu, and then egeneto, and then egenometha, and then egenesta, and then again onto. And so this is the difference between I became, you became, he, she, it became, because it's third person singular. We became. Y'all became, if you want to pull the southern accent on it. And then they became. This is just the paradigm here, just to kind of understand how it works. We see first person singular, second person singular, third person singular, first person plural, second person plural, and then finally third person plural. Pretty standard stuff, what we found already. But this is basically the second aorist. There's no difference in function. The second aorist is going to function identical to the first aorist. The form, though, will be the difference between a regular verb and an irregular verb. And this is just a good idea of how it works. This isn't exactly the same where all regular verbs in Greek are going to kind of have an ed in English. Same thing with the irregular. But this is just a good general idea of how to work with the second aorist. The form, different. The function is going to be the same. So with that, let me just kind of write out what we've learned with the master verb chart, and that will be our lesson for the day. So, and the one thing I noticed with the master verb chart this week when I was putting it together was it descends in order from first principal part down to the, well, actually that's not entirely true, but for what we know now, if there is some descension from the first principal part down to the third principal part, which we've learned some of today. So tense, augment or reduplication, tense stem, tense formative, connecting vowel, and then personal ending. So if our tense is present, no augment, tense stem is going to be present. Tense formative not there, Omicron epsilon, and then personal ending is going to be primary active. Present middle passive, present Omicron epsilon, primary middle passive, hopping down to the imperfect, imperfect active, augment yes, present tense stem, tense formative, Omicron epsilon, secondary active, imperfect, middle passive, epsilon is our augment. Again, we're having the present tense stem, no tense formative, Omicron epsilon, secondary middle passive. And then now we're down into the future, so we have future active, no augment, future active is our tense stem. Tense formative is going to be a sigma, Omicron epsilon, primary active, liquid future active, I should say. No augment, future active, and then this is going to be an epsilon sigma, Omicron epsilon, primary active, and then we're going to go hop down to the future middle. No epsilon, I'm just going to write FA just for short, and then sigma, Omicron epsilon, primary middle passive, and then we're going to hop down to the liquid future middle, no epsilon, future active, so we see that that is all the same there, epsilon sigma, Omicron epsilon, primary middle passive. Now we can hop down to the second aorist, what we've learned today. We're going to go second aorist active, augment, yes, because it's past tense. Tense stem is actually going to be aorist active, third principal part. I'll just write 3 2, 1 here. So first principal part, second principal part, third principal part. There is no transformative in the second aorist. There is a transformative in the first aorist. Again, difference between form and function. And then the connecting vowel here is still going to be Omicron epsilon. And then we're going to look at secondary active. And then second aorist middle. Again, we need that epsilon because it is past tense. Stem is going to be aorist active. There is no such thing as an aorist middle stem or a future middle stem or a present middle stem, which is why we're seeing them take the future active stem. No transformative, but there is a connecting vowel, and then we're going to have a secondary middle passive. So the good news here is that this is half of the master verb chart. We still need to fill in the first aorist active and the aorist passive, which would be the fourth or the fifth principal part, and then we would also need the perfect active and the perfect middle passive, and that would be the fourth and the fifth principal part. So we have half of the master verb chart done. And again, I really want to stress that the difference between the second aorist and the first aorist is not function, but is form. Thank you.